Hi, my name is Salma. The infographic reading that I got, the title of it is called Contested Citizenship, The Dynamics of Racial Identity and Social Movement, and it's by Anthony W. Marks. For the main arguments in this reading, I put that in this infographic reading, the main argument is that citizenship, social movements, and racial identity formation are all connected in creating and solidifying racial identity and responses to state policies. I put that another argument that is connected to this is that exclusions from citizenship help set boundaries and help make permanent racial identities that then leads to a response from certain groups to change policies. And I found both of these arguments on page 159 of my reading. For the supporting arguments, I started with a quote that I think is important to keep in mind when reading the article. The quote is, "Social categories of identity thus shape social outcomes," and this quote was found on page 159. The author supports their arguments by comparing the dynamics of racial identity and social movements in South Africa, United States, and Brazil. We learned that in South Africa, the effects of segregation and political exclusion according to race led to a response from groups to create mobilization and as a response to available opportunities and resources. A quote that backs this up is that these dynamics of collective action were determined by the process of identity formation, exclusion solidified identity, and created the opportunity for mobilization demanding inclusion. And this quote was found on page 170 of my reading. Another supporting argument is that in the United States, we see that the racial identity and citizenship is as old as the Republic. In the reading, it says that when the shift of federal policy and the development of Black identity were influenced by the spread of mass media. In the U.S., civil rights activism emerged in response to reforms and with a more militant response emerging in reaction to the reversal of such reforms of urban inequality. And this information, I found it on page 177 of my reading. The last thing that supports the author's argument is when he compares the dynamics of racial identity and social movements to Brazil. In Brazil, we see the effects of how a state-enforced ideology of racial superiority has a negative effect on solidifying identity according to race. Brazil appears to be an exception to the logic of racial identity formation and mobilization. It fits that logic by demonstrating the relative lack of relevant causes produces an absence of race-specific consequences. And this was found on page 128 of my reading. Some key terms are, first, identity formation. This means that identity formation means the emergence of boundaries, a particular identity as a social actor. And this was found on page 162 of my reading. The next key term is exclusion. The definition of this is that it defines and unifies who are subordinate and invites pressure for exclusion. Identity formation and opportunity structures are thus connected. And this was found on page 165 of my reading. The last key term that I have is that Afro-Brazilian affairs. The definition of this is that it encourages limited political activism around race-supported celebrations of the centennial of abolition. And this was found on page 181 of my reading. Some connections that I found that are connected to the required readings of this course was first in the article Su casa es nuestra casa. The quote that I have here is from the article. It says, "Thus, the study of Latino group identities and the political events shaping those identities have both extended and broadened the disciplines of understanding the role of individual and group identity and political behavior in mobilization." This was found on page 517 of the article Su casa es nuestra casa. This quote connects to the article because it talks about how the development of identity of Latino groups occurred because of political events that brought people together as a social or political movement. The next required reading that I'm going to connect my infographic reading to comes from the Treaty of Guadalupe. The quote that I found was that Mexico had granted citizenship to civilized Indians and Blacks, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo clearly stated that former Mexican citizens would be given the opportunity to become citizens of the United States. And this was found on page 66 of the Treaty of Guadalupe. I put that this connects to the article because in the article it highlights and talks about one of the important things of having dynamics of racial ideas and movements. I put that the article says that gaining citizenship is like a frame for mobilization, which starts a movement and starts the development of an identity. For my analysis, I put that the development of racial identity is important in the States. The author references 3 countries to demonstrate the importance of this dynamic. The countries that Marx references are South Africa, the United States, and Brazil. These were important countries to reference because we were able to see that when people are aware about racial injustices that have occurred in the political system and in society, they're more prone to building an identity, and mobilization will occur for change. We see that this happens in South Africa and the United States. It's important for governments of societies not to ignore the past struggles of minority groups and their needs, as it helps them understand their racial identity. If a country's society isn't aware of its racial identities, they're sort of stuck in time. In Brazil, there is less racial identity consolidation and protest, and that quote was found on page 165 of my infographic reading. I put that in Brazil society, the norm is to be white, and that's the goal, and there is an obvious superiority of white Brazilians, which then leads to having zero political movements and movements from less represented groups. This highlights the importance of understanding and having a developed idea of racial identity. It is important to be aware of this because it promotes for effective movements, protests, and changes in government systems. Next, I put that Marx brings attention to the fact that Brazil is an example of a society in which a simple ideology has led to develop a whole system and population beliefs. In Brazil, the belief of white superiority is something seen in the government and the way that society functions. My question is it too late for the Brazilian society and government to develop or create a racial identity instead of trying to whiten their population? If so, what major steps would have to be taken and how long would it take to develop? In the reading, another question that I have is that in the reading, I noticed that the author explains how social movements occur. In the United States, we learned that media helped bring attention to events occurring against African Americans, and sooner than later, movements asking for change and policies began to emerge. My question is, did media coverage speed up the process of the change, or would the groups of people leading the movements been enough for change? Would society have developed differently if this were the case? And that is my information for my infographic. Thank you for listening.